Hi folks, I'm Aliza Wenders and welcome to this talk called The Benefits of Simplified and Complex Systems from the Player's Standpoint. I know it's a bit of an intimidating title, but it's generally about game design as a theory and as actual implementation in games, turn-based games in particular. Uh, a bit of information about me before we start this small expedition into the world of core systems design. I'm a programmer and a game designer, and I have been for the last 20 years. Starting as a child, before then, modding and creating levels for games that were very popular that time, like Doom or Heroes of Might and Magic 1 or 2. So, yes, I'm that old. Uh, and one very important thing is that I'm an avid fan of role-playing games and classic board games. And this is not important because of me, it's important to our topic because that's where we're going to start about exploring what it means for a system to be simplified or complex when we're talking about turn-based systems in general. And why is it important? And what can we deduct from analyzing systems that is relevant to today's games or the games in the past 3 decades. So the talk will be divided in 2 parts really. In the first part, I am going to talk about general game design, and in the second part, I'm going to show or rather talk about more examples from games you know or from games we can fantasize about and how the complexity of their core systems would behave when the player tries to interact with those games, what kind of user experience it would mean for the player, and why is it important to know that the levels of simplification or complexity, it really is a question of viewpoint. How does it attribute to a game being enjoyable or deep enough, as they say, to, for example, warrant some replayability? So this is what we're going to do. Uh, I'm not a native speaker of English, as you obviously know by now, but I am trying not to butcher everything I say, but excuse me for my mistakes in advance. So, uh, role-playing systems, that's where we're going to start, because what role-playing systems really want to do. There are a multitude of answers you can give to this question, but what is important that be it a fictional or a reality-based world, a universe that these systems try to give the player as a playground for their adventures, basically role-playing systems try to describe a reality with all the rules that apply in that reality, uh, starting from the frames of reference like space and time down to the level of how your hit points or how your attacks can be expressed as numbers or some attributes that you can interact with more easily than, say, simulating all subatomic particles and seeing the outcome, which is obviously uh, impossible. It's not the matrix. So when we say simplified and complex systems, the first thing we have to accept that all systems we play, however complex they may be, they are simplifications of some reality. And this is very important because basically we can say that we are not talking about simplified and complex systems, but we're talking about complex systems because all systems are complex. It's definition. What do you mean by complex? it can change, but every system that is playable is a simplification of some abstract reality behind that in order to be playable. So one thing I want to say before we get into all the more interesting and detailed stuff is that I'm not in favor of the more complex or more simplified systems. I enjoy both. I think you enjoy both, but it can be a personal preference or based on narrative or what the game or the world you're playing, if we are talking about role-playing games, try to convey as an experience. A more complex or more simplified system may be preferred, but it's up to the game designers to decide which would benefit that narrative the most. But this is something we will return at the end of the talk to summarize what we what we can and what we can take away from our exploration. So, when I say simplification of some reality, let's start with the two most important and absolutely constant things that are part of every system, even non turn-based systems. And these are space and time, or space-time if you prefer, because we ourselves live in a, let's say, three-dimensional reality with time added as a bonus. I'm not going into space-time physics or physics of any kind because uh, that's a slippery slope with too much depth. But we can agree that this is our personal experience, that we are in a 3D space and there's time. And in order to convey a world where we can define custom rules like spells or skills or whatever that can work and can be played regarding to rules that every participant of that game is experiencing the same rules in synchron, which is very important because that's the base of playing together. All systems need to do something with these two very complex things, space and time. So I said I'm not going into physics, and I won't. I'm just saying, if any of you know something about physics, you know that it's much more complicated than just, oh, there's three dimensions of space and there's time, be it a dimension or something else, and we're good. Um, Obviously, a game system can't reflect this. And moreover, what we need is a way to be simple enough that the players can play it without too much hassle. We don't want space or time to be some obstacle you always have to take extra attention to to handle. And that's why turn-based games are the most prominent in discovering solutions for this. What they do is they divide up time and to turns, rounds, or rounds that contain turns, as we in our real life do subdivide time into years or months or days, which give us some measurement of what is happening, and it's very important. But turn-based games are special in a way that this division of time is interconnected with the rules in order to simplify uh, the experience of the time passing. So we are not going to uh, measure a spell's duration in nanoseconds. We are not going to, you know, what we do is, oh, there's this spell or there's this skill. Its duration is 3 turns because it's easy to handle. And the more simplified this thing is, this subdivision, for example, we just have turns and that's all. Maybe we can say something that a turn in real life would translate to 10 seconds. It's just for reference so the players know what a turn really is. But after that, we don't really care about seconds. We just care about turns. And if my character can attack 2 times in a turn, it has an order by some other rule. And we know that happened in a turn, and we're not talking about seconds. And this helps the synchronization of what is happening. On the other part, space is much more complicated because there's a lot of ways you can divide space. In real life, we use metrics to measure distances or volume, but when we are playing a game, this this is more of a choice from a game design perspective because in a role-playing game you can still say, oh, that's 3 miles away, or you see a building that is 20 meters tall. You can say those things, but this is not what we are talking about. What we're talking about is how fast your character is in combat. And in general, all the things I am talking about are specifically true for the combat systems of the role-playing systems we're talking about. So the combat part of things is where the simplification of space and time is very important because otherwise it would be so complicated. It would be impossible to effectively play the game or a turn or whatever the smallest unit of time is would take hours in real time, and nobody wants that. Maybe someone wants that, so there are some games where a turn takes a lot of time, but it may have some benefits for those players who enjoy that kind of games. And this is the second part of the talk where we're going to uh, deduct these takeaways. Um, so what can you do about space? It's a thing of abstraction. For example, if the narrative dictates or it fits the narrative the best, we can create a system where space is represented by rooms and only rooms. The only thing important is which character is in which room with what characters, and maybe what connects these rooms together, maybe corridors, that's another unit of space, but maybe it has the same rules as rooms, just some special rules apply to corridors that don't apply to rooms. It's uh, it's another thing how many layers of rules we want to apply to things that are that have a common ancestor, so to speak. Uh, from a programming standpoint, it's very funny because if any of you uh, know object-oriented programming, which is very common nowadays, um, this is how systems work. Uh, Generally, there's an object which with some rules that apply to it, and some other objects may inherit the properties of this object. For example, there's the object room with rules that apply to it, and the corridor is just another type of room with some special rules, but all the rules that apply to rooms also apply to corridors. Maybe there's some overrides, but basically this is how systems manage to keep all the things together with a common set of general rules. That's why board games are also important to consider because role-playing games in general have very long, very detailed rule systems. And board games generally have much shorter, more streamlined rules. They can be still fairly complicated, but because board games are very limited by their physical presence on the table, and there's no game master that simulates this whole world for you, they have to be very precise with their rules, and have to have short rules and a limited number of rules, because no one would want to play a board game that takes 50 hours to learn how to play. That's insane. One very common direction you can go in is dividing space into a grid of fields, or rectangles or hexagons, or some kind of unit that is general. These can measure the distance. They can also have more abstract rules that apply to them. For example, if we are going to treat space as something made of a grid, then the range of some weapon, or the area of effect of some effect uh, or spell can be described as two grids, three grids in radius. And it's very easy to see, very easy to display, very easy to understand. And if you look at turn-based tactical or strategy games on computer since the dawn of time, this is what you see mostly. Uh, because in computers back then, you had a very limited memory, a very limited processing power, and this also constrained what you can do. And treating the battlefield as some matrix of units was the most easy way to describe things for the computer, and to store data. It's very effective to this day. And on the other hand, this is what is most useful for the players. The interesting thing is that you can simultaneously have something divided into a grid and still measure actual physical distances, or take some other factors into consideration, like a line of fire. So nowadays there are more and more games that do both in reality. So, for example, they let you move on the grid and take cover at a grid based on what your surrounding units of space contain. For example, a wall, then you have cover into the direction. But at the same time, they treat, for example, line of fire and line of sight as some continuous area where ray tracing is a very simple solution in examining if from my gun something is reachable by a bullet or not, or I can see that enemy behind the barrel or not. And this is an interesting question I will talk about later. These hybrid systems that combine simplicity of one subsystem with the complexity of another subsystem, because make no mistake, ray tracing in the 3D world is very complex in terms of under those terms I'm talking about, because there are actual virtual 3D coordinates of things, and facing of polygons, and all kinds of layering problems may emerge. So from a system design standpoint, it looks very easy. If there's a line between attacker and defender, then the attacker can attack with a ranged weapon. So as a rule, it's very simple, but the implementation is not that simple. Not not as a program. As a program, it's very simple to do, but the theory behind it, because then we're talking about real space basically with real coordinates. That's not simplified, and the hybridization of these two systems is not always the best solution, uh, because it creates artifacts like, oh, I can move there or I cannot move there because that's a grid that is occupied. But on the other hand, oh, this bullet can go through there because it was raycasting, and though those are two units of space where there's obstacles, somehow the ray tracing went through between two polygons, and suddenly I can hit something that on a board game or in a, yes, that was impossible if you were playing a board game, a classic board game. If you were playing a classic RPG system with a game master, he would say, "Oh, there's a hole in the wall. If you roll a high enough score for aiming, I don't know what system I'm talking about, it's just an example, uh, you can try to shoot through that hole." But that's another. Having a real living game master who governs the game is obviously a very big benefit of classic role-playing games, because it allows for a mesmerizing level of complexity. Because the human brain, your game master can always decide if something is viable or not viable, can be done, cannot be done, what will be the result. Maybe he or she throws some dice, but overall he or she will decide what happened, and this is what in computer games we cannot do. Computer games are very rigid, and that is why it's very important to see how these simplifications alter the player's experience. And this is why it's not a good thing to have complex subsystems and simplified subsystems at the same time in a game. But let's move on. So this was space and time, and let's look at another subject for simplification, some kind of abstract entity like the player's health. So we're talking about turn-based games, we're talking about turn-based combat games in general or in particular. Obviously, we want to measure how a unit or character is, what status they are in. One thing is health or hit points, HP, integrity, if we're not talking about living things. You can names don't really matter. What matters is how we treat health. So there's a number of approaches, and in system design in general, this is very important because all other systems that are connected to this decision will be altered by this decision. On the one side, we have health as a discrete property that is made up from a finite number of health chunks, for example. So we can say that every character or a character has X or Y hit points, which is a fairly low number, a low enough number that your brain can easily comprehend it and it easily fits on the screen, like 5 or 10 or 15. And we can put on the screen 15 little chunks of red line or something like that, or generally it's a very small number, so when you look at it, it's absolutely understandable without thinking about what that number means. So this is what I mean with discrete distribution or division of health. On the other hand, we can go, technically speaking, with floating points, floating point numbers, and say that health is represented by a value between 0 and 1, and we can multiply that factor of health by anything, and we get a JRPG with trillions or billions of health points. But that's not discrete. That's what I call an analog or continuous division of health. It's not really a division of health, because and let's see what each of these approaches do. Mm, if you have a low number of discrete hit points, every damage you take is much more emphasized. It also depends on what is your maximum health, of course. If the character only has 3 hit points, for example, in a hardcore platforming game where it's very it's punishing, and it wants to punish you for hitting a spike or hitting an enemy or falling into water or stepping on fire or something like that. You lose the third of your HP in one bad move. It's intentional, and it communicates to the player that it's not a good thing. It's not something you should ever do. But hey, we are nice. You can do it 2 times and only die when you do it the third time. If you have a 10 or 15 health, for example, in a tactical turn-based game, it means, yes, my character can take some damage. Uh, also, obviously, it depends on how weapons do damage. Uh, Naturally, for a low hit points or a generally low hit points system, weapons don't do too much damage. For example, 3 to 5 damage, and then you can say, oh, my character can take 3 or 4 hits before he dies. What is really interesting that you can do this same thing with uh, a factored health system, because you can say, oh, this weapon does roughly the third of your HP, because we say that you have an HP of 2 trillion and this weapon does 1 trillion, so it takes half of your health away. Or we can say, if your health is absolutely represented by floating point number, it takes 1 point half. Uh, but you can also say that it only takes a very, very small percentage of health. And you can play between those two very big hits, very small hits, and everything in between. And the benefit of this is that you can fine tune much more dynamically how much damage someone takes based on some conditions, so you can more easily apply percentages or modifications to the damage number and still get a reasonable number out of it. For example, with a buff that does 25% of damage reduction, you would only get 750 million damage instead of 1 billion. But if our health was measured in small chunks, that would mean instead of taking 10 damage, I'm going to take 7 damage or 8, based on how you uh, round numbers. You round them up, you round them down, and the smaller your HP is, it's but for a system with 10 or 15 HP at most, 10 is very big. So if we stick with weapons that do 3 to 5 damage, and I have 25% damage reduction, it doesn't really work, because if they do 4 or 5 damage, then I will only be injured for 3. But if But if they do 3 damage, I still be injured for 3, based on rounding. So these kind of systems don't really work with small numbers, and this is something that should be considered when designing a system from the ground up. Uh, Unfortunately, in some games, they use low numbers for measuring things and then still apply this kind of percentages. It can work, of course, but I think personally that it doesn't benefit the player to have a small small units for HP, for skills, for damage, and then also have percentages that give or take and modify, because why? If I have low enough numbers to represent different attributes on my character, it's more easy to say, here's +1 HP, here's +1 damage, here's -1 damage. Uh, and many systems that use low profile measurements do this. And it's good because it helps the player to instantly understand uh, what something does, a skill or a buff or a debuff, and it's easy to understand um, without thinking, and it's easy to understand how it changes uh, things. For example, if I have a weapon that can do 3 damage and I have some bonus that gives +1 damage, I will intuitively understand that it's a big bonus. But if it says it gives you plus 20%, it won't even work for something that only does 3 damage. So these are things that are important. One last small topic before going into more examples, more concrete examples, and the viewpoint of the player, uh, is the interconnectedness of systems, uh, of subsystems in a bigger system. Let's stay with health, and so it's very easy to say that characters in this system have health, and it's somehow represented. It doesn't matter how, but this is rarely what happens. In most systems, this is only a derivative of something deeper. For example, a health attribute or some endurance statistic, or can be improved by some skills. Maybe you can choose from different species or races of characters with different backgrounds, and that modifies your health too, or maybe gives you a static reduction to damage, incoming damage. Uh, and these systems are very layered and become very complex very quickly if one just follows what is natural. And this is what we see in tabletop role-playing systems. I know very few of these games that take things very simplified. Uh, their whole purpose is to present you a world, a complete world where you can be anyone within limits, of course. And generally, and when I was designing my role-playing systems, I did the same. Maybe you want to start with some very well understandable simplified systems to make it a fast-paced system, something that something where you don't have to calculate things all the time. But as you test it, as you play it with people, there are questions. Oh, what I can do now, because I have this idea and it's not in the rule book, and we can do this way or this way, and eventually a rule has to be written for it, and maybe that rule has no foundations anywhere in the system, and you have to say that, okay, we have to have this new attribute, this will be applied to all things, but for your character it is now slightly elevated or raised due to his race or class, and things get complicated over time. But as I've said, in a role-playing game, it's not a problem because you have the game master and you have the rulebook and you have the time. It's a session. It can take long. Everyone knows it takes long. The computer does the calculations for you. It's a very nice thing because in theory, one can have very complex systems behind a game uh, because you don't have to roll dice. You don't have to apply percentages. You don't have to manually subtract values from your preliminary rolls and then compare it to something else. The code is written, the game does it instantly and gives you some result. But if things are too complicated, which is not a problem, the problem is the complexity needs to be communicated. So if you don't see what happened in under the hood, then it can raise questions. So it's not a problem for example, some elemental resistance, because somewhere on your character sheet or character panel in the game, you see you have 10% reduction to fire damage, and when you take fire damage with your character, you don't really need to see some. You know it. You know he has some kind of damage reduction. You see he suffered 90 damage from fire. Uh, if it's not too complex, you're not going to focus on deliberately. You are going to focus on other elements of the game, your tactics, your positioning, your attacks. But if these systems are very emphasized and are always in play. For example, if I have this passive skill, this gives this, and then I can activate this active skill that does this, and I have this gear that also increases this. And because my character suffered some kind of injury in the previous mission, he also has this, and this is all together. You are not going to be able to enjoy the game in the long term if it's not clearly communicated. And maybe it's what I mean about a clear way of communication is, for example, having a character sheet where you can go to your resistances and it will be detailed if you want to read it. That's enough, that's clear enough. But from a game design standpoint, and I'm not talking about game design as a theory, I'm currently talking about game design as designing an actual computer game with user interface. It can get tricky because you have to find the space on the screen for this information, or find the space where you can view this information in a separate screen, but the two-click rule should apply. So there's this rule in general user interface design that every function or information should be available in 2 clicks from the user, or 2 key presses. Uh, that's the same in this context. So if I have to click 3 times to get some information about my resistances, it's not good. And but to achieve this 2 clicks rule, uh, maybe the general interface becomes cluttered with information, and and the very interesting thing is you have to know what your game should feel like. So role-playing games get away with this because everyone who wants to play them wants to play a complex system with rule books and another rule book and the player's handbook and the bestiary and some other expansion rule book, and it's all right. Board games know that this is can be very cumbersome, especially modern board games with all the tokens and markers and all the stuff. It's hard enough to put all the tokens in places and never forget to move them or remove them. But the rule books also tend to be complicated, and they should not be. But if you want the game to be complex enough for replayability and fun, you have more rules. And for more rules, you need to have a longer rule book, and this is a problem. And the same applies to computer games. The most important question is, what do you want your game to feel like? But this question is also tricky because it has a preconception about your audience. Who do you want to play your game? Who do you think will have fun playing your game? Because if you're targeting hardcore tactics gamers, they will want that information. They will they will want a system where armor penetration, all kinds of resistances, weapon overheating, weapon magazine size, accuracy, and so on. These are things you can see, you can modify, you can count into when attacking. But to accommodate this, the whole game will change. The user interface will change. It will have a lot of details. And I'm talking about having a good user interface. So you know what you're doing. Your user interface designer knows what she's doing. So it's not a problem of, oh, it's cluttered or it's ugly. Everything is all right, but still there's a lot of things because it's needed to play the game effectively. And then if you want to say, okay, hardcore gamers will find this fun, but really these statistics or some of these statistics are under the hood really. So how armor works or fire resistance really works, it's enough if the casual player sees that, oh, I have taken fire damage, oh, I have armor, and they will be satisfied with this. They will be bothered by all the other details that they can always see. And this is a new kind of problem, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit. It's kind of a zeitgeist problem. And so we have taken this road. I have said that generally what we're talking about is simplification, whatever we're talking about. Uh, Even the most complex systems are simplifications of some kind of reality. On the other hand, there are complex systems that have multi-layered, more interconnected subsystems, and there are simplified or systems I call simplified, or we can agree to call simplified, where there's not that much going on in terms of calculations and what depends on what and derivations of values from each other. And obviously, these kind of games focus more on more intrinsic player experience. And what are the benefits of each of these approaches? This is the main topic of this talk. The benefits of the players when playing a complex or so-called simplified system. And I have said I will give you some examples, but I don't really want to compare existing games that others made. So I'm going to give examples from my field, and that I hope will be interesting enough. So one example is when I was designing a classic tabletop role-playing system, a fantasy game system. Uh, this is the kind of the classical approach when you have skills or spells. Let's treat both as one thing for now. And your character has some proficiency in a skill, and also he or she may have some attributes that also contribute to the power level of a skill or a spell. And in my system, it was also accompanied by how much fatigue or how much mana or power uh, you would power into casting that spell or using that skill. And this resulted in a matrix, a table of skill level and fatigue you put in, and you had an effect strength associated with each variation. And you had a table like this for almost all skills, and almost all skills had a different table. And of course, the number, the effect strength you got from your table was also interpreted in a different way. So there was another part of every skill and spell that said one effect strength of this will do this, but if you have at least 15, then this effect will also apply, or you can choose if you want it to apply. Uh, what what is very interesting that it worked because it was a role-playing game, not a computer game. You had the rulebook in your hands, and there were some spells you used all the time or some skills you used all the time. You never learned all the values because you had your book, there was the table, and you could always look up the effect strength, and then you knew what to do with it. And it gave each skill or spell some extra character because these tables can be fine-tuned during testing if we found that it's too weak or too powerful. But ultimately, I did not like this system because it had a lot of tables for all kinds of skills and spells, and I I wanted to redo this system with only a few tables that would be universal. And I created this FX strength table, which was based on all the information I gathered from previous play sessions. And of course, for each spell and skill, the detailing of what each FX strength would mean would be altered. But basically, it worked too. So now we had one table at the end of the book, at the beginning of the book, or on a separate sheet. You could have this, and whatever you used or casted, you could look at this. And it was very good because it was simple, but somehow the character of some skills or spells got lost with this because now the system was too uniform. It was easier to play, easier to understand, easier to compare the different levels of spells or skills in terms of power, but it was not that interesting to use a specific skill or spell. This is something I didn't anticipate, and I think it's a good example of I don't know what the takeaway is. For me, the takeaway was that if if the circumstances let it, then you should have as much complexity in your game as possible without hindering the player experience. And you should not oversimplify things just for the sake of keeping them simple or because fearing that some player may get confused at the beginning when they don't understand the system yet because they see a lot of numbers and tables and oh, I have to learn all this. No, So if you do it right, you don't have to learn all these, but these give you an extra in your game if done well. If done badly, then you will never understand all the skills and all the descriptions and all the different effects, and it will always confusing. So this is why one other thing, but it's not an example, it's just something I left out previously. Another thing you should always think about when playing or designing a game is why they have passive skills, active skills, either or both, because it's very, or neither. That's also possible. But generally speaking, everything, even your health, counts as a passive skill in some mm, abstraction. So, and I think it's another very interesting topic that doesn't fit our time, of course. Uh, the game I'm now working on is USC Counterforce. I opted not to use any active skills. Uh, it's an example because I it's a fairly complex system. You have damage resistance, protection levels, action points, health, morale, armor, frontal, rear. Weapons have very many different properties beside damage, and it's very neatly presented, I think. It's a bit intimidating when you first look at it if you don't know this. But for example, games 20 years ago, like Jack the Lions 2 or the original UFO, they also had some complexity to their systems. In UFO, you had almost 10 or maybe more character attributes, and half of them was very obscure. What would they really do until you play the game and realize what they do, or why are they important or not. Uh, but So I opted for not using any active skills because I want the player to focus on their movement, their positioning, retreats and attacks in a way that is the most important thing you can do in combat, because it's a more realistic approach in a way that everyone can shoot or everyone can go into Overwatch. So I don't think that should be a skill. Uh, just focus on what every of your Marines do. Instead, I opted for having passive abilities applied to all skills at a certain level, or if you choose to invest more into them, uh, that give a bit more damage, a bit more damage reduction. Some actions have action point cost reductions and so on. And and I was asked that why isn't in the game there's something like retributing strike. So when you are logged in a melee combat and you want to move away, why don't the enemies hit you or try to hit you, and why you can't activate an Overwatch? And these two questions. The second question, you can, every single one of your units can activate Overwatch because it's a basic ability and you don't need an active skill. And the other thing, and it goes back to space distribution, division, uh, and mm, how you approach things. I think a turn-based game is a very you have very much choice. You have very many choices when designing a turn-based game because the division of time is inherently a very important part of it. Uh, you can do it any way you want, and one way is to say that every player, including the AI, has a turn, and in their turn they can do whatever you want. And when it's not their turn, they won't really do anything, save a few exceptions, because it's not their turn now. And it if the game is complex enough as it is, it helps to do not over complexify the system, because you have to uh, have to focus on all the small details of your units and your weapons and the environment, lots of hazards and all kinds of mess that happen, and you really don't want to. It would be too much to also have to take consideration about about an enemy lashing out to you, and the game is hard as it is, so it would be also very punishing not to allow your units to escape. Uh, and this is because the game system itself is complex, and I really didn't want to overburden the player with even more uh, considerations they have to make. On the other hand, if we take some other game where where there are not too much attributes, not too much abilities, weapons are simplified, they have a damage, and maybe that's all they do. Maybe they don't even have ammunition. You have to reload them from time to time, but there's no ammo you have to manage in your inventory. You don't run out of ammo, for example, you just have to reload. And even the game tells you uh, when you are trying to move what will you be able to hit from that point, so you don't really have to consider the obstacles on the map, consider the structures on the map, and visualize in yourself, will I be able to hit that if I put this unit here in Overwatch? Will I be able to hit that unit or not? uh, for example, in the old games, it was up to you. No, the game did not help you to know if you will be able to hit something. You move there, try to attack, and you saw that, oh, I can't target that unit. I thought I can. Or maybe that block there is still in my way. So you moved another grid to the right, and then you had a line of fire. Some modern games don't do this. They even tell you what can you hit, and it works. It gives you a dynamic. So it's a benefit of simplified systems. It gives the player an instant dynamic experience of combat, less thinking, less risk in what they don't know. And these systems can have this kind of active abilities and kind of triggers or events more, because without them they will be very flat. Then it would be obvious that these systems are very flat in themselves, so they have room for active skills which give more depth to tactics, and it also works. And maybe maybe the takeaway from all this is everything can work if it is polished enough to a level where it's good. I know it sounds stupid, but one thing I see is that many games nowadays, they look good, sound good, they have ideas in them, but somehow they lack that kind of polish in their systems, because if you throw in too many things and just let it breathe, maybe it's not that good. Maybe it can be balanced. If you have some very good ideas that are original, even never seen before, and you put it in and say, "Oh, we have this very original new thing," and that's all. that won't be enough. That will fall flat after a time, however good it is, because systems themselves, um, without their context, the presentation, graphics, lore, narrative, without all that, systems in themselves have to be tested for balance and for a kind of integrity. This is my this is what I wanted to really say, and maybe a few things about balancing. Um, it's also very interesting that you would think that, and I don't want to say that complex or simplified systems are better or worse for balancing. I'm just going to say that one would think that a complex system will be much more difficult to balance because there's so much variables, so much attributes to fine tune for all enemies, all weapons, all kinds of things you encounter. While uh, so-called simplified systems have fewer weapons, fewer attributes, so it must be easier to balance. Uh, I don't think that in my experience, this is not the reality, because if you think about it, complex systems are basically nonlinear dynamic systems mathematically, and they are not that prone to a change in parameter than systems which have less parameters. So when you are playtesting a complex system, you can fine-tune things as you go, and the system itself will, if there's no fundamental problems with it, of course, the system itself will correct itself, so to speak, because you will see, oh, this weapon is slightly underpowered, whatever I do with it. So, okay, let's give it in more iterations, of course. Let's give it a bit more damage, a bit more, I don't know, armor penetrating power, and you test it again, and it kind of falls in line with enough iterations in testing. If the system is designed well, it will become a living environment with all its components that are in balance. On the other hand, with simplified systems, you can more easily say, okay, you can see beforehand if something is too much or too is not enough. For example, the damage of a weapon, because there's not too much to look at. So you can strike a good balance at first, but that's not necessarily true. And these systems, even if one enemy is slightly overpowered, or your units can't move far enough, that instantly results in a total unplayable situation. And you have to do many iterations too, to make sure that all the parameters that are in the game are tuned to a level, or between levels, that won't result in some crash outside what you wanted, creating a situation which is basically unplayable. Or the other thing is, you 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 can just face roll the enemies because something is uh, too overpowered. Uh, the takeaway is you have to test both systems, but the approach is different, and that's why I generally don't think to marry complex subsystems with simplified systems that the player sees, because that this task becomes impossible, and the player will feel that something is not good. So I have a simple interface, I have simple actions, but on the other hand, I feel that something very complex is going on, and and there's not much information, or there's too much information in this submenu somewhere, and I don't want to cancel this. So because I thought it was a simple game. On the other hand, if it's too the game is presented as too complex from the beginning, then it will never appeal to players who just want a simple experience of playing it. So this is I'm not saying you have to strike a balance, because maybe you want to go for this or that deliberately and make a game that is this or that. But I think, and this is my final word, I think to make a good game, um, so what I want to say is, the computer game industry, make no mistake, it's part of the entertainment industry. Computer games are forms of entertainment, and movies in general are part of entertainment, but there are those films that are sad and too serious and generally called artistic features. uh, I don't count them as entertainment right now, because those are serious films about serious issues, serious people, and they are very important, but I wouldn't call them entertainment. On the other hand, I would call entertainment the comedies. And what they say about comedies, that they are the hardest to make in the film and industry, because to have your audience laugh with you and enjoy those stupid jokes you thought will be good, and that's the most hard thing for the writer, for the director, for the actors, to have the audience laugh with you. And this is true for games, I think. When you make a game, you must understand that you are making something that is part of the entertainment industry, and your main goal is to have the player enjoy the game you made. This might not be true for all games. Some games deliberately say, I'm a punisher and I will punish you. That's all right. But they are for an audience who want that punishment. So basically, it's also a form of entertainment, just for a smaller audience. But in general, your game should be entertaining. And that's why I think it's very important to understand that uh, it's not about the UI or the graphical presentation or how you interact with things or how you click things, what feedback the game gives as information for you. The problems, or the problems to solve, uh, start more earlier. They start when you begin designing your system from the ground up, from scratch, because you have to look at board games and role-playing games that were really the predecessors of modern computer games, uh, turn-based games in particular, and and you have to learn from those systems, because in every computer game, every tactics game or strategy game we play on the computer, there's an underlying game system that is independent of the presentation, really. The system itself has to work in itself, so to say, and this is something to think about. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day.